Towards the end of the first quarter of the last century, the belief in ghosts and the fear of supernatural appearances began here and there to be considered as silly and dangerous. About this period, some young men who were pursuing their studies at Vienna and lived on friendly terms together manifested a strong desire to shake off all the prejudices and superstitious notions in which they had been brought up. They soon perceived, however, that it was only by slow degrees that this object could be accomplished. Nevertheless, one of them, named Joseph Bernhardi, who was apt to talk rather big, insisted that, at the age of 22, he had long since completely conquered the grossest of his former prejudices, for instance, the dread of apparitions. "Yes," said one of his companions, "I know as well as you that devils and spectres have not the power to hurt us. I am as firmly convinced as you can be that God is much too gracious and tender a Father to abandon us to the power of evil spirits. But still, I cannot wholly free myself from the influence of the silly gossip of my nurse relative to this subject, and though I know there is no such thing as the hobgoblin and the demon to whom she threatened to give me in order to keep me quiet, and laugh at all such nonsense, still an obscure feeling of some inexplicable connection of night and darkness with the occupations of invisible spirits pervades my mind, and, in spite of my better convictions and the arguments of reason, I cannot entirely suppress it. In particular, I cannot pass late at night by the charnel house of our churchyard with coolness and composure. An involuntary horror comes over me, and I always quicken my pace, though I am thoroughly satisfied that the dead will lie quietly enough in their graves, and that those to whom the bones in the charnel house once belonged have not the power to do us the least injury." Bernhardi laughed heartily at this frank confession, and was not sparing of sarcastic remarks to his friend. "For my part," he added boastfully, "I would engage to go tonight into the vault close to the charnel house, and give the corpse deposited there a few days since a slap in the face without feeling the least alarm." His friends, on account of his swaggering, took him at his word. "As to the slap in the face," said they, "we will cheerfully excuse you and the poor corpse from that, but we shall expect you to prove tonight between 12 and 1 that you are capable of doing what you assert, or we shall all consider you as an arrogant braggart who has a heart in his mouth, but none where it ought to be." Bernhardi was almost offended because his companions seemed to doubt his assurance, and declared that he was quite ready to submit to the required test. One of the students was acquainted with the family to whom the vault in question belonged, and found means to procure the key. In the evening, the party assembled at Bernhardi's apartments, and awaited with impatience the arrival of midnight. 12 o'clock at length struck. They gave the resolute Bernhardi the key to the vault and a fork, which, to prove that he had really been there, he was to stick into the coffin containing the corpse, to which he had proposed to give a slap in the face. The students, for the sake of ease, were in their morning gowns. Bernhardi, without quitting his, set out on his sepulchral expedition. His friends thought they could perceive him change colour when they put the key and the fork into his hands, but he left them in apparently the highest spirits. They concluded that he was still in the same predicament with themselves. They were all firmly convinced that no harm was to be apprehended in the vault from a real ghost, but yet they could not help shuddering when they fancied themselves in his place, fork in hand, beside the coffin. Bernhardi stayed much longer than they expected. According to their calculation, the whole business might have been performed in less than a quarter of an hour, and yet the clock struck 1, and he had not returned. They began to be uneasy at his long absence, and to apprehend that some accident had befallen him. They accordingly agreed to go in a body, with a lantern, to the vault in quest of their friend. By the way, they still entertained hopes of meeting him, but were disappointed. The reader may conceive their alarm when they at length found him extended upon the ground before the open door of the vault, and to all appearance lifeless. They instantly lifted him up and spoke to him, but received no answer. They held the lantern to his face. It was pale as death. His mouth was wide open, as though in the act of screaming, and his eyes seemed starting from their sockets. As soon as his young companions had recovered from their first fright, they lost no time in taking the necessary measures for his revival. In the first place, they loosed all those parts of his dress which, by their pressure, tended still more to impede the already obstructed circulation of the blood. The strongest of them then took him on his back and carried him home, while some ran for a doctor, or were otherwise occupied in arrangements for the recovery of their unfortunate friend. Not a moment was lost in useless lamentation or frivolous conjectures, for they well knew that the delay of a quarter of an hour might, in such a case, prove fatal. The moment they had reached his chamber, they undressed him and put him to bed, laying him on his right side, that the determination of the blood to the region of the heart might not be increased, frequently sprinkled his face with cold water, and held to his nose a smelling bottle containing volatile salt, for want of which the best vinegar may be employed. After they had persevered some time in these attentions, some faint signs of returning animation were perceived. The doctor and his assistants redoubled their exertions, and at length had the inexpressible satisfaction to recall to life, by their efforts, the apparently inanimate Bernhardi. The happiness which they felt at his revival was destined, however, to experience a severe drawback. They at first supposed that he was unable to speak from weakness, but unfortunately he never afterwards recovered entirely the power of speech. The violence of the fright had paralysed his tongue, and for a long time he could not articulate a word so as to be understood. When asked what had happened to him on that unfortunate night in the vault, he shuddered, and by signs desired pen, ink, and paper to be brought to him in bed, on which he answered the inquiry of his friends in the following words: "I have been severely punished for my boasting and presumption. I reached the coffin without perceiving anything that at all resembled a ghost, but when I had, with trembling hand, stuck the fork into the coffin and was retiring with the utmost precipitation, something detained me by seizing my morning gown. I struggled to extricate myself, but fell senseless with fright to the ground, and know not what happened afterwards." On reading these lines, Bernhardi's friends were not a little astonished. They were not disposed to question the truth of his statement, but their reason had many objections to urge against it. How could a ghost hold a person fast by the morning gown? How could an immaterial being have hands to grasp any material object? They puzzled their brains for a considerable time in vain to reconcile their friend's account of his adventure with the voice of sound reason. At length they resolved to examine the vault itself, in hopes of discovering some traces of the supposed spirit. Without communicating their intention to Bernhardi, his inquisitive comrades repaired the following night at the hour of 12 to the vault. They had the good sense to equip themselves against any emergency, because experience had taught them that such precautions impart courage for the pursuit of an inquiry of this nature. They took care to be provided, among other things, with several lanterns, for the same spectre which had terrified Bernhardi out of his wits in the dark might perhaps prove, in a good light, to be a mere trifle. They thus proceeded with all due precaution to the vault, searched every corner of it, looked among all the coffins, but found nothing. At length, one of them perceived the fork which their unfortunate friend had brought with him the preceding night. It was thrust deep into one of the coffins, and from it hung a small piece of cotton. "Thank God!" cried he. "The ghost is discovered. See, here is the fork, and a bit of cotton out of Bernhardi's morning gown. The poor fellow, in his hurry, pinned his gown with the fork to the coffin, and then imagined that it was a spirit which held him fast." Perfectly satisfied with this discovery, they quitted the dreary abode of death, and hastened next morning to their unfortunate friend, to communicate to him the solution of the mystery. He immediately took up his morning gown, and sure enough, not only was there the expected hole, but the bit of cotton was found to fit it exactly. Bernhardi was greatly rejoiced at the discovery of the delusion, but never perfectly recovered the use of the organs of speech. Supposing Bernhardi's friends had possessed less enterprise and resolution than were required for the cool investigation of the nature of the imaginary ghost, that is to say, of the natural cause of the fright that overpowered him, what then? What would then have been thought of this story? The circumstance would certainly have been deemed inexplicable and attributed to the operation of some evil spirit, and one generation would have repeated the tale to another with dismay and horror. Or, supposing Bernhardi had not stuck the fork deep enough into the coffin, so that, on retiring, he had pulled it out again with his morning gown, without tearing the latter, what clue would there have been to the discovery of the real fact? In this case, his associates would probably have found the fork lying on the pavement of the vault, but would have been unable to conceive how it came there, as their comrade declared that he had stuck it in the coffin. For there would have been no bit of cotton to explain the mystery, had they even possessed sufficient good sense to consider that it is not always possible to detect the natural causes of effects vulgarly attributed to supernatural agency. Still, this would not have been sufficient to satisfy Bernhardi, who, as long as he lived, would have firmly believed that an evil spirit had really held him fast by the coffin and deprived him of speech as a punishment for his presumption. And in fortune it was an evil spirit that occasioned his misfortune, namely the spirit of superstition and prejudice, which had been instilled into him in his infancy by the pernicious gossip of silly people. He afterwards acknowledged to his friends in writing that he really imagined he could have gone without any emotion of fear into the vault, but as he entered it, he was seized with a horror which convinced him too late that he had not yet wholly freed himself from the childish terrors of his early years. "Happy," added he, dropping a tear on the paper, "happy are they whose mothers and nurses have the good sense to avoid everything that can sow in the tender infant mind the seeds of this superstitious fear, which all the arguments of reason cannot afterwards wholly eradicate."